Orange Nation, I'm Coach Drew and welcome to Orange Theory Fitness Wilmington. Today we're going to do a deep dive into the hip hinge. So it's one of our 7 fundamental movement patterns. We'll talk about the rest of them throughout this week. Yesterday you got a deep dive into our anchor points, our shoulder, our core, and our hip anchor, and we're going to tie that into the hip hinge as well too. Now the hip hinge is very unique because we see it in all pieces of the Orange Theory workout. You'll see it on the treadmill, you'll see it on the rower, and most specifically you'll see it in the weight room in many different forms. If we set our body up for success and we set our anchor points up correctly, there's very little risk of any kind of injury, and we're working most of our muscle groups in our body through the hip hinge. Let's go take a look. All right, so here we have Miley power walking up our incline, our first chance to see the hip hinge throughout the Orange Theory workout. Now notice she's not completely tipped over, but there is a slight hinge from her hip as she climbs up this hill. Power walking specifically, but even runners and joggers, as we make our way up these higher inclines, the hip hinge does play a factor. The second place we see the hip hinge is on the rower. So we talked about the treadmill, and now coming to the rower before we head to the weight room, the row hip hinge is part of our 3x3. So as we talk about order as coaches, we drive back with our legs, core, and arms, core, and legs. The core part of our stroke is all of the hip hinge. So we'll dive into it in just a second, but as we can see here, we got Coach Laura hinging from her hip after her leg drive to engage her core. That bar is getting pulled into her lower chest before it extends. So now Laura, if you'll stay at the end of your stroke and just hit the hip hinge with your arms. So if we were to pretend that she was standing on the ground, this would look exactly like a deadlift. All right, so let's do a deep dive into the fundamentals of the hip hinge. So we got Miley being our example here. So Miley, if you'll take a step to your right, turn around. We're gonna use our OTF stick. You guys can use a hockey stick, a broomstick, or PVC pipe, or anything you have straight at home. But we're gonna go ahead and put it against her back. She's gonna hold it here for us. We're looking for 3 points of contact. Rotate a little bit, there we go. So 3 points of contact according to our anchor points. So we've got our shoulder anchor point, which is gonna be correlated with her head to the stick. Her core anchor point, which is gonna be correlated with her mid-back to our stick. And her hip anchor point, which is gonna be correlated to her tailbone on the stick. Now, if Miley does it correctly, all 3 anchor points will stay in a neutral position, staying aligned with our OTF stick as she hinges over. So go ahead. Great, grab one more for us. All right, so that was a great looking hip hinge because her spine stayed neutral, her shoulders stayed packed. We engaged all the muscles from the bottom to the top. Now, if we go into common errors and we disengage any of our anchor points, that's going to correlate with a misplacement of our body and performing the exercise incorrectly. So if Miley disengages her core anchor and disengages her chin anchor, disengages her shoulder anchor and drops her chin, and then goes for the hip hinge, you see that her head leaves our OTF stick, meaning that the anchors through her chest are disengaged. So if she places her head back, the most common error that we end up seeing is the head tilting forward as we go up into our hinge. So if her chin draws forward like she's trying to look at herself in the mirror, we get space between her middle back and our OTF stick. And then another common error that we see is the arching or rounding of our back, disengaging our core and our shoulder anchor, meaning only the middle portion of our OTF stick is touching and her head and tailbone are off. All right, so now that we've talked about the anchor points, our shoulder, our core, and our hip anchor, let's go in and set our foundation and build everything up. So like last week, we went over our running form and how base sets that foundation. We need to set the base or the foundation of every movement that we do and correlate all the way to the top. So if Miley keeps her anchor points in place, she starts from the bottom by keeping her feet about shoulder width apart. She's engaging her calf muscles, her hamstrings, her glutes, her core, back, and upper back. So go ahead and hinge all the way over for us, Miley. Let's make it perfect. Awesome. Now, if we take a look at the different errors that we do see, so if somebody's looking at themselves in the mirror as they go into that hinge, Miley, go ahead and tilt your chin up. We see an arch start to develop in her low back. So if that chin moves, we know the cervical spine is moving and tension gets placed through our lower back. If she disengages her shoulder anchor and her shoulders start to collapse and she arches her back into that hinge, rounding her back over, we see this arch coming through her spine, meaning that her shoulder anchor is disengaged. And then lastly, as we hinge over, we'll see later in our deadlift, if her knees buckle together, go ahead and try to buckle the knees together, we disengage through that hip anchor. So those are some of the common errors that we see during our hip hinge. Our most common and highly used form of hip hinge that we see is the deadlift. So Miley will find our perfect deadlift where those shoulder anchors are engaged. She's got our lats tightening all the way down. She's got all 3 anchor points engaged and squeezing through those hamstrings and her glutes on the way up. Then if she ditches one dumbbell, we also see a hip hinge swing. So the hip hinge swing is the exact same as our deadlift, and as we work our way through them, it's just going to be more power coming from our posterior chain, those calves, hamstrings, and glute muscles. All right, Miley, go ahead. So powering through. See, we have slightly more knee bend than a traditional deadlift, but all 3 anchor points from her head to her tail are still staying engaged. So now we got Laura here going over some non-traditional hip hinge movements. These are isometric hip hinge movements, meaning we hold the hip hinge and then perform other exercises in other muscle groups. So Laura's going to demonstrate a hip hinge low row for us. So she tips over at her hip, we got a soft bend in her knees, just like she would in a deadlift, but now we're contracting through the lats, but notice how her core anchors, shoulder anchors, and hip anchors all stay engaged the whole time. So another place we see a non-traditional hip hinge is on the floor, some of our core work. So if Coach Laura goes ahead and does a V up here, we're still hinging at our hip, even though it's not a hamstring and glute dominant movement. We're tackling our core and hip flexors, but her anchor points are still staying engaged. If she were to stand upright and put the ground where her feet was, it would look exactly like the deadlift. Our last example of a non-traditional hip hinge would be the Bosu single leg V-up, just another example of us being able to use this hip hinge all the way throughout Orange Theory workouts. Now only one side of her body is hinging, but it's still that hip hinge movement coming from that side, tackling her core instead of her hamstrings and glutes. All right, Orange Nation, wrapping up our hip hinge video. We've seen it in all places of the room. It's one of the only fundamental movements that we do see all the way around the Orange Theory workout. We saw it on the treadmill, on our inclines, that slight hip hinge. We see it in the rower with an even bigger hip hinge to help activate our core. And we more specifically see it in the weight room as we activate both our posterior chain, our glutes and hamstrings, and our core. You're activating major muscle groups throughout your body. Actually, your 3 biggest major muscle groups, your core, your muscles through your back, and the muscles through your legs. There really isn't anything better when it comes to movement than the hip hinge.